My name is Andy, by the way. I'll be chairing the meeting. Dealer's choice.
Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the Case for Socialism. That's the name of our talk today. My name is James Hoff. I'm a professor here in the English department at BMCC, and I'm also a proud member of Socialist Alternative, which, along with Socialist Students, is one of the organizations putting this talk together today. And before I introduce Theo, who's going to be giving the talk today, and Andy, I want to talk just a little bit about the subject of Theo's talk, which is the case for socialism, and how that relates to our day-to-day lives as students and workers here at BMCC and at the City University of New York. Now, I haven't seen or read Theo's talk, and I haven't seen Theo speak before, but I'm really looking forward to it today. But I have a feeling that what he's going to talk about today, that underlying everything he says, is going to be the central premise, the central fact, really, that capitalism has failed us. Capitalism, with all of its promises, wealth, innovation, and civilization, has failed us. As Rosa Luxemburg said, exactly, I didn't know this till today, exactly 100 years ago in 1916, we have two futures ahead of us, socialism or barbarism. We either have a civilization in which the means of production are democratically controlled and planned by a vast majority of the people for the benefit of all, or we have a future in which the economy is controlled by a shrinking minority of elites for their own interests. Now, I imagine all of you have been paying attention to what's going on in the world. You're all here today. That gives me an indication that you've been paying attention. And in just your short lifetimes, I'm sure you've noticed the devastation that capitalism has wrought in the last just few decades. From the vast transfer of wealth in the United States here, from those with little to nothing, to those with vast astronomical sums of money and power. The exploitation of the developing world to make products like iPhones and sneakers, in which millions of workers still work in sweatshop conditions, commit suicide every single day out of depression and desperation. I'm sure you've seen the destruction of the environment on a global scale unlike we've seen in the history of humankind. And then, of course, I know many of you in your day-to-day lives have probably experienced police violence, racism, bigotry that capitalism creates. I want to say, because we're out of college, if you think, I know many of my students, they think going to college, getting a bachelor's degree, and somehow miraculously entering the middle class is going to be an escape from this. But I tell my students all the time that that's a fantasy. The fact is, most students that pursue a bachelor's degree don't complete the degree. And those who do, as well as those who don't, often acquire vast sums of debt in the process of pursuing that education. And the reason why education is so difficult to complete a degree, why it is so expensive, why so many students have so much loan debt, is because, frankly, capitalism doesn't care about you or your education. Here at CUNY, we have been on the receiving end of the stick of capital for a very long time. You guys might be familiar with this concept of the carrot and the stick, right? It's a metaphor. In many ways, the vehicle for that metaphor is a mule. How do you get the mule to carry your shit from one place to the next, right? You can lure it with a carrot, you can entice it, or you can beat it with a stick. And capitalism gives us carrots and sticks, right? When people are angry, when they organize, when they rise up, capitalism gives us carrots. If you look at the 1930s, for instance, during the Great Depression, when capitalism was weakened, and the labor movement was very strong. And there was a very strong socialist movement in the United States. People were able to wring concessions from capitalism. Social Security, Medicare, later Medicaid, and welfare, and the great system of public higher education that we had in the 40s and 50s, which really began to sort of grow and expand. A public higher education in the United States that became the envy of the world, really. But here at CUNY, over the last 3 decades, we have been receiving the brunt of these cuts, right? So when capitalism feels emboldened, when it's not challenged, when it's strong, it uses the stick, right? And austerity has been one way that capitalism has taken back those gains that were made in previous periods and reasserted its dominance. And that's sort of one of the periods that we're living through right now. And austerity is one of the ways that that's been carried out. And at CUNY, we've seen it very clearly. What used to be a great public university, 100% publicly funded, free, open to all, has been reduced to a semi-private institution in which a vast majority of the funding for the university now is paid through tuition by students, and less than half of CUNY now is funded by the city and the state of New York. It used to be 100%, now it's less than half. So you can see the trend here is towards privatization, right? Tuition at CUNY has gone up, since 1989 to 2016, it's gone up 400%, more than 400%. So it's gone from $1,200 to about $6,400 today. And on the other side of that, the faculty have also been receiving the brunt of these cuts and this kind of austerity. Faculty wages have, believe it or not, plummeted during the same period. If you looked at wages for an assistant professor in 1989 and compared it to an assistant professor today, and adjusted for inflation, you might say, yeah, they're the same, or hey, it's even a little bit higher. But that's very deceptive, right? Why? Because the faculty has been radically altered during this period, right? The percentage of tenure-track assistant and associate and full professors who are full-time employees is less than half of the faculty now. More than half of the faculty are adjunct professors who are paid who are at-will workers, who are paid by the course, who have little to no benefits, and who make about 1/3 of what full-time professors make. And the result of that is that the quality of education, not only at CUNY but across the nation, has been dramatically altered. And so you can see the ways in which capitalism affects us, even in our day-to-day lives as students and workers. Now, Theo is going to talk, I'm assuming, a lot more today about how we can organize and fight against capitalism. And before I introduce him, I just want to say quickly, I don't want you to take away from what I'm saying today this notion that our goal is to wring concessions from capitalism, right? Because what I want you to take away is the fact that capitalism gives with one hand and takes away with the other, right? And that the only way we can break that cycle, our task is to break that cycle, is to build a socialist future. And that's what we're going to talk about today. And I'm hoping that Theo will be able to offer us a vision and a way forward for that. So let me just say a little bit about Theo. I'm very happy to have him here at BMCC today. He is a member of the Socialist Party UK, which is affiliated with the Committee for Workers International, which has sister organizations in countries across the world, including Socialist Alternative here in the United States. And he's also a leader in the Socialist Students Movement in the UK, which has been fighting back tuition hikes or tuition fees and raises in the UK for several years now. It's important to know that in the UK too, not that long ago, education was free, and now it costs practically as much as it does in the United States in over a very short period of time. They're really getting hit hard in the UK. And so before Theo speaks though, Andy, who's chairing our talk today, is going to just say a few words about how the discussion is going to work and what happened. Have a seat. Okay, so it's all yours.
All right, thank you, James. So also just, I want to plug again, before you leave, definitely get in get on the sign-up sheet so we can get in contact and continue to organize together going forward. My name's Andy. I am a member of Socialist Alternative. I'm also on the Socialist Students Organizing Committee here in the U.S. Socialist Students in the U.S. is an initiative that's being launched by student members of Socialist Alternative to help build a broader fight back against the billionaire class and for, against all the attacks that young people face under this system, and to put forward a socialist alternative, no pun intended, but kind of, against what's been going on. So what's going to happen here is that Theo here, who James introduced, is going to speak for just a short spell, and then we'll open it up for a short discussion where folks can come in with questions, comments, and that sort of thing. Then we'll throw it back to Theo at the end for a brief sum up, so we can kind of try and pull it all together. And I can talk a little bit more about the discussion when we get to that point. But for now, Theo, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks, James. I thought it was a really good opening to the meeting, a fitting introduction. Briefly, I just want to go over what I'm actually going to be discussing. I think it's important when we're looking at what the student movement here in America faces, and to understand how that fits into the crisis of capitalism on a global scale, and how that exists in relation to the global crisis of capitalism. I want to move on then to discuss more particularly developments here in the United States, particularly with the youth movement, which developed around Bernie Sanders and also the rise of Donald Trump. And then finally, I just want to discuss briefly how we've actually been using socialist students in Britain, how we've used it to organise on the campuses, and how we've used it at the moment in a particularly difficult political time to win young people over to the ideas of socialism. I think as we approach the end of 2016, it's very, very clear that the crisis of capitalism globally isn't going to end in 2017. It's definitely going to carry on into the indefinite future. And I think not only is the crisis proving to be very, very long, protracted, but it's also, we've got to remember, not restricted to a country, a single country, or a handful of countries, but it's a thoroughly global crisis which essentially affects the working class and youth and student movements the world over. And these issues that include, but aren't restricted to, foreign military interventions and war in the Middle East, terrorism and instability in Europe, sexism, religious intolerance and institutionalised racism, and the uninterrupted destruction of the environment. And I would argue these are all symptoms which aren't particular to a certain model of capitalism, like James said in his introduction. They're not particular to neoliberalism or any of that, but they're actually ingrained within the DNA of capitalism itself, an extremely irrational system which essentially polarises the wealth to one section of society, finds itself increasingly unable to harness that wealth, harness those resources for the social benefit of all. And one such indicator of this is that this year global inequality still remains at a record level, and where around about the richest 10% worldwide own about 50% of what we term household wealth. And I think even more significantly, we can see that capitalism is essentially unable to fix its own problems, specifically the 2007-2008 financial crash. And moreover, not only is it unable to fix these problems, but it looks like another crash, potentially is deep, more acute and more severe than what we experienced in 2008, is on the horizon, particularly coming out of the Chinese economy, which was previously touted by a lot of these academics and supreme economics professors, etc., along with countries like Brazil and India, what they termed emerging economies, touted as being the saviour of capitalism on a global scale. But recently China has been experiencing a significant economic slowdown. And this is linked to the fact that although China in 2008 did manage to fare the economic crash fairly well, with huge cash injections into its stock market by the central government, the resulting levels of debt which built up in the Chinese economy risk launching a new debt crisis, a new economic crisis which threatens to pull the whole world into another 2008 situation. But more importantly, we don't just be talking about economics here. Like all economic woes, they actually form very, very concrete social and political consequences on the ground. In particular, the slowdown in construction in China has antagonised large sections of the Chinese working class, and that's why Last year and this year we've seen an upturn in strike action, struggle on the ground all across China, as workers have been threatened with mass redundancies by the Chinese state, but perhaps more significantly, large sections of what we term the middle class have been particularly antagonised as they relied heavily on the stock markets, which are now failing, their profitability is failing. They relied heavily on the stock markets for an increasingly elevated position in society, helping them along with social mobility. And the slowdown in China has had no less effect on industries in Europe. In Europe, where the rich and the capitalist class, as we call them, are clearly very fast running out of options to save their system, and at every single opportunity they're looking to offload the effects of the crisis onto the shoulders of working people through anything, wage cuts, the tax on trade union rights, and the tax on living standards. And I think the signs of panic amongst the rich, the elite and the ruling class are very clear in Europe. The IMF, an organisation called the International Monetary Fund, in April of this year warned of a fresh economic crisis all across Europe, linking to the profitability of the European banks. And only in July there was an article published in the Financial Times which reported warnings received by Italy's third biggest lender, warnings it received that it threatens to pull the entire Eurozone into a fresh economic crisis. And again, like in China, these economic conditions have resulted in very, very obvious social and political consequences. At the start of this year and earlier, we've seen really something that's been, I think, mirrored here heavily in the US, the widespread erosion of the basis of support for the traditional establishment parties. For example, in Spain, at the start of this year, we saw a huge drop in support for the right-wing Conservative People's Party, who lost 3.6 million votes in elections at the start of the year, giving way for a new popular left-wing party, Socialist party called Unidos Podemos, giving them a path to rise, and they finished third in the latest round of elections in Spain. But we've seen the opposite effect happening in France, where the National Front, a highly xenophobic and nationalist and racist party, headed by the notorious Marine Le Pen, have made huge gains in recent elections in France. Of course, as you could imagine, off the back of terrorist attacks not only in France but all across Europe, themselves again linked to the imperialism and foreign military interventions which have been occurring over the past decades in the Middle East. But the growth of support for these political parties, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. They're a solid response at the ballot box by working people who are desperately now seeking out solutions. They're looking to the left and to the right. They're seeking out solutions for wage cuts, decreasing living standards and cuts, decreasing job security. Wages which have decreased by more than 10% in Britain, Greece and Italy. Across Europe, youth unemployment is a particularly scary problem, a pertinent issue. It remains at 50%, 44% and 37% in Greece, Spain and Italy respectively. Now all of these separate, but I would argue interlinked problems have compounded recently with the European Union's biggest calamity really that I think it's ever faced in its lifespan, with British exit from the European Union. And we can talk a bit more about this in the discussion afterwards. I won't go into it that much here. But Brexit, which was essentially a working class revolt against the faceless European bureaucracy and economic elites, which for decades have had to essentially drive down British and European working class living standards into the dirt. Now this is just, I'm barely scratching the surface here on the scope and how wide the international crisis of capitalism actually is. I haven't discussed the recent struggles which have broken out in India, where an estimated 180 million workers went on general strike there and downed tools. Political turmoil in South America and Brazil with the recent political coup against the elected president Dilma Rousseff, and of course the events here in the United States. But the point is that I'm trying to make here, if we're going to fully understand what we face in America, particularly what young people face in America, we have to understand it in terms of a global crisis, and therefore we have to understand it in terms of initiating an international fight back against the capitalist system. Now, what is the future for young people here in the States if they carry on along the same trajectory? Well, I think, like all countries the world over, really economic crisis and chaos is all that young people have known. I was around about 12 years old when the 2007-2008 economic crisis economic crisis occurred, and this has caused widespread radicalisation amongst wide sections of youth in the country. It's now widely understood that young people make up the biggest section of what we now term the precariat, that is, people coming out of college, like James touched on in his introduction, people with university degrees, coming out of college, educated young people who all that waits for them are low-paid, insecure jobs. Whereas for previous generations, our parents' generation, there was an understanding that capitalism could deliver the goods. It could deliver constant social mobility, constantly increasing living standards. But that myth, I think, with this generation of young people today has been thoroughly shattered. And with young people also burdened heavily by record levels of college debt, a significant percentage of youth nowadays are actually considering what they think to be, or what they understand to be, I should say, socialism, and in a more favourable light. In a recent poll, whereas less than a third of under 30s said they have a favourable view of capitalism, over 43%, significantly higher percentage of those under 30 have a favourable view of what they understand to be socialism. This has been reflected in struggles all across the country, beyond the universities and the colleges as well. We've seen young people leading some of the most militant union and workplace struggles, with the fast food workers in their fight for $15 an hour minimum wage. And with the average college graduate in 2015 finishing college with $35,000 worth of debt, we saw student members of Socialist Alternative last year organising 15,000 students in the streets of over 110 college campuses nationwide. So there's a lot of anger which exists at the moment. That's, you can't deny that. But this anger, of course, can't be understood, I don't think, without mentioning the effect that Bernie Sanders' campaign within the Democratic Party primaries had this year by calling for a political revolution against the economic elite, against the 1% and against the political class. Bernie had a huge effect on those looking for a socialist alternative. But beyond that, I think he gave a lot of people, well, not just young people, working class people in America, a real solid understanding of what a new third party, new political formation outside the Democrats and Republicans could actually look like. What would a new political party look like when it's separate from corporate money, when it's separate from big business? The Bernie movement really did give a solid template for what a new political project on the left in America could look like. But we have to be clear, I think, that Bernie Sanders unfortunately did fail in delivering what he initially promised, and that was solely down to the mistake, the fatal error he made in committing himself to the reformation of the Democratic Party, a party which for decades has been thoroughly committed to pro-capitalist, anti-worker, anti-student and anti-student policies. And it was for this reason that every stage, we in Socialist Alternative, yes, although we supported Bernie Sanders critically, we understood the effect he had on American society, we understood the layers which were being attracted to his movement, we wanted to constructively intervene in that movement. At the same time, we warned that Sanders would have to make eventually a break with the Democratic Party if his political revolution would be seen through to its logical conclusion. And I think by endorsing Hillary Clinton now in this bit of sort of lesser evilism, he seriously risks contributing to the disillusionment, the anger of corporate politics and establishment politics, which has given rise to Donald Trump in the Republican Party. But I think there does still exist an opportunity to continue with what Bernie started with Jill Stein in the Green Party. And again, I think we should give at least some discussion over to this after the lead-off. But I think a strong vote for Stein this election, even if it was only 3%, you could really see now the establishment, the roots laid for a new political formation in America. But beyond that, we're not interested in just building a party which can win elections. We're interested in building a party which takes part in community campaigns, is thoroughly rooted in trade union organisations locally, as the organised bodies of the working class, along with other movements, the movement for LGBT rights, the Black Lives Matter movement, community campaigns and student campaigns. And I'd argue, there's 43% of Americans now, they don't consider themselves aligned to any political party. Only 26 and 29% of Americans respectively consider themselves either Republicans or Democrats. And with only 14% of eligible voters choosing either Clinton or Trump in the primaries, I'd say there is huge potential for the growth of a new political formation in the States. Now, I'd like to talk just a little bit, when we're talking about socialism and this new left party that we're trying to build, what we're actually talking about, programmatically, politically, what would this party stand for? What are we talking about when we're talking about the socialist alternative? And now, I want to be clear. We support Bernie Sanders and Jill Stein's call for a $15 an hour federal minimum wage, free universal health care, free college and university tuition, all funded and based on taxing the mega rich in this country. But at the same time, we argue that this is a programme which doesn't quite go far enough. And this is largely to do with what we consider socialism to be. And since I've been in America, I've heard especially from a lot of Republicans, they falsely accuse Europe of being socialist, or a handful of European countries of being socialist. But I would argue that what has existed in Europe over the past 30, 40 years has simply been a friendlier form of the capitalist system, where workers, through mass struggles, through revolutionary struggles, have won concessions from the rich, have won concessions from the government. But essentially, the system of capitalism, where big corporations, the banks, resources, money is all privately owned and dominated by an economic elite of the 1%, still remains thoroughly intact in Europe. And what we do recognise, and we fight for reforms, we fight, as we did in Seattle with our elected representative Sean and so on, for $15 an hour minimum wage, because we recognise the material benefit that these victories provide to people in their day-to-day lives, and also importantly the boost of confidence a victory such as a $15 an hour minimum wage can give to a movement. We still argue that they don't go far enough, and on the one hand this is because we think that any reforms won under capitalism are only temporary, they can never be permanent. For example, in England we've had for decades, since the end of the Second World War, a system of free healthcare, the National Health Service. Now that was only won again through essentially a revolutionary struggle waged by British workers in the aftermath of the Second World War, but through successive governments, and not just through the Conservative government, but also through the Labour Party as well, over the decades, as capitalism seeks to extract profit from as many markets as possible. The National Health Service has been slowly privatised, and we're now facing a situation in England where the NHS is potentially faced with all-out privatisation. The government are trying to push through a new contract with its junior doctors to try and stretch the public service as thin as possible and open it up to private markets and financiers. But furthermore, we'd argue that by seeking to simply reform the capitalist system, the mechanism through which systematic poverty is maintained and wealth is taken off of workers and polarised to the 1%, the economic elite in society, that always remains thoroughly intact. And what that essentially means is that economic chaos and economic crises are always there, always possible, and as a consequence, social unrest and political unrest can occur at any given time. And that's why we consider ourselves revolutionary socialists. And we call for the commanding heights of the economy in America and internationally, the biggest corporations to be taken into democratic workers' control and management, so that the vast wealth that exists in American society, the technology, the new scientific breakthroughs of the modern era can be used and harnessed in a democratic and rational manner, democratically planned, to create socially useful jobs, advance our economic productivity, and bring about a truly democratic society. Now, before finishing, I'd like to just talk a little bit about the work that we've been doing with socialist students in the UK, and the campaigns we've led, and how we've actually been using the organisation to attract people and discuss the ideas of socialism. Now, what is the bread and butter day-to-day organisational work of socialist students? What would its principal task be? Well, I'd say it's to organise political discussions like the one we're going to have today on the campuses, on a range of issues, current issues, anything that we see in the news, like the Black Lives Matter movement, LGBT rights, historical stuff, examples of workers' revolutions, strikes, and the lessons of these things that we can take from the movement today. And I think by holding open meetings which welcome people from different political traditions, different political backgrounds on the left, and we can sort of hash these issues out and try and win people over to radical ideas. But I want to highlight that we're importantly not aiming at the same time to be a talking shop, although political discussions are like I said, our bread and butter day-to-day work, the very base of what we're trying to build on the campuses. We want to be taking the initiative and leading campaigns in the universities and colleges. And we've been doing this in the UK. You know, we've organised campaigns on a range of issues. You know, struggle for adequate and cheap student housing, anti-sexism and anti-racism rallies on campuses. Last year, we held an extremely successful national conference, which hopefully this is something, once social students here built up to, we can start building formal structures nationally. In the past, for example, at Leeds University, we led an extremely successful demonstration from the university of hundreds of students. That doesn't sound like many, but in Britain it actually is, through the city centre of Leeds. At Nottingham University, where I study, there's been a living wage campaign happening on campus. On the one hand, we've been attending organisers' meetings, discussing with the trade unions, you know, encouraging them to unionise the workforce, pushing them in a more militant action, in a more militant direction. But at the same time, we've also been organising meetings and political discussions amongst the students, trying to get the discussions going, make them understand the importance of actually coordinating action between students who are looking towards, you know, free education, coordinating action between themselves and the workforce on campus. And I'd argue that, you know, with political terrain as volatile as it is at the moment here in the US, with the move for free education, with the anger around Black Lives Matter movement, and by building an open organisation which seeks to unify all these, at the moment, separate struggles, unify them into a single thread, I think that all that we have so far managed to build in Britain is possible here. So just to conclude, you know, this is why Socialist Alternative, we call for a new mass left working class party in America that doesn't just stand periodically in elections, but between election cycles builds a movement, a social movement, in order to challenge and eventually, hopefully, sweep away capitalism itself. Yes, we support and we call for, again, like I've said, $15 an hour minimum wage, free universal healthcare, free college tuition, but we think there is a need to go beyond that in our programme. The need for socialism along revolutionary lines. And I want to say at this point, people can ask questions about this afterwards, not in the mould of Stalinism, a thoroughly undemocratic system which developed in the 1930s in Russia based on privilege and bureaucracy. We want revolutionary socialism based on the principles of democracy. And democracy is something which a lot of right-wingers in American society, a lot of supporters of capitalism, they say democracy is the thing they cherish and support most. Well, we do as well, but we want to see democracy extended beyond just simply presidential elections. We want to see democracy extended to our workplaces, to our national industry, to our communities, our banking sector, and crucially, to our police force as well. It will mean a world where workers democratically elect committees to plan the economy and production, not on the basis of greed of the 1%, but rather on the basis of social need. A world which would essentially allow for democratic workers control and management of their own lives and futures. And I, implore you, if you want to help us in the fight for a socialist society, get involved, help us build socialist students here, but more importantly, I urge you to join the Socialist Alternative as well.
So thanks, Theo, for that excellent introduction speech. So I think what Theo's speech really points to is that because of the very volatile situation that exists around the world, we're seeing a global political polarization and a fight back on many different levels, especially it's most pronounced amongst young people. You can see this bubbling up in different ways in the US around Black Lives Matter. I mean, even the recent protests in the NFL with Colin Kaepernick and the national anthem, but also I think it leads to the question of what to do in the presidential elections, right? You got Clinton and Trump, both are reviled politicians, but Trump is getting support and is coming close to Clinton, but at the same time, Clinton is not supported by a mass of people. It's like young people. And I think that's an interesting question of what to do in the general election. Socialist students and Socialist Alternatives calling for a vote for Jill Stein as a way to deal with that. But I think these are some of the things that we can get at in the discussion, either questions or comments. So what I'll do is if you want to raise your hand to come in with a comment or a question, I'll take a list of names, and then we'll go through them one by one. If you have a comment, just try and keep it to, for the first round, about 3 minutes, so that we have time for people who want to speak to come in and speak, and maybe we'll have time for a second or even third rounds, depending on how that goes. So yeah, who would like to speak? What's your name? I'm sorry? Okay. Anybody else? Or questions too? What's your name? Okay. I'm sorry? Alright, well we can go ahead and get started. If you want to come on stack, just raise your hand while another person's speaking is okay.
Right now, it shouldn't be a two-party system of kids. And when you break up the Democratic vote in a situation where Trump is getting all the support, then Trump will win. So voting Jill Stein is not the policy anyway. It's really